Welcome to another episode of Creative Leaders Unplugged. I'm Morgan here with Arna, and today we're talking to Colin Skelton. He's many things, a traveler, a creative, and also works with a lot of theater and applying theater, facilitator, embodied design. What else am I missing, Arna?
Yeah, no, he's many things, and to me, actually, the main thing, something I've learned from him. I've known him for quite a while, and what he really brought to sort of to the community of design thinkers and sort of designers and that community is embodiment, sort of this take the your whole self. It's not just your brain, it's not just your rational bit, but and I kind of, which wasn't per se a new thing, but it was something he was able to really create a language around that, and with his experience in theater and all the kind of all the also his experience with Japanese theater, and he brought this kind of this idea of ma, and there's all these philosophies. He has a very deep knowledge and experience in all these different philosophies. So he brought a language to it, and he brought this. So he was able to say, yeah, we didn't have any language around it. We just kind of knew it as facilitators and people who were maybe a little bit of experience with theater. We knew it was there. We knew embodiment, bringing your whole self, and it's not just your body's not just a vessel for your brain. We knew that, but he came and he had a whole language and a whole, deeper knowledge and yeah. So to me, that has been extremely valuable, and I've learned so much from it. Liberating, and I think I've said that a couple of times in this podcast. To me, it was always liberating. Like, oh yeah, see, you're like, oh yeah, I knew that. Yeah.
My body is more than just my brain.
I knew it. Yeah, right. I knew that, but I didn't have the language, the words, or the proof, the evidence. And yeah.
Yeah.
And also,
and what Go ahead.
No, to me, great. No. We now have to edit this out.
No, we keep it. This is life.
I'll keep it, yeah, because I'm lazy. I can't edit. And no, but seriously, that's the kind of that's the creative leader, right? Who says, hey, here are all the other options. And you're like, huh? And I have the guts and the sort of I'm fearless in the sense that I'm going to show it, and I'm going to talk about it. I'm not going to keep it away. No, I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to show how it works. And yes, it's odd maybe, but I'm going to bridge that gap for you. I'm going to make it safe for you so you can actually start doing it. And so this kind of person that kind of gives you these options that you didn't even know were there, and gives you the language and builds the bridge so you can join him. And that, to me, that's such a beautiful kind of thing to be, I think. So I appreciate it.
It's really, and we've talked a lot about different moments, like expanding awareness as well. And I think that's what a creative leader does, and what Colin does really well is, and also from what you're saying that he's contributed to the community, is that he's opened up this awareness as there's more than one way of doing things, and this is how we might take the next step.
Exactly. Yeah. So I really I know that there were so many other things we could have talked to him about, and
had to cut it off. We kept talking.
Yeah,
okay.
I had to. Yeah. So I really want to see him back again, and so we can kind of continue this conversation, because he's one of the few people who can really talk about these things in such a profound way, in such a
it flowed really easily, and somebody who came in with no knowledge or experience in how his way of working. He was new. I met him for the first time this morning, and it just flows so easily, and it makes a lot of sense. And he starts explaining things, and there's a red thread, and it was just really delightful and inspiring, this conversation.
Cool. Okay. Well, let's listen.
Yeah, I hope everybody's also inspired. So
yeah, all right. Enjoy.
I'm a traveler at heart. I'm comfortable on the outskirts of the town, and I also love to find my way in the middle of the chaos and explore and be stimulated by the madness and the organized chaos of society. And then I enjoy retreating again. I enjoy the anonymity of being in foreign places. I'm a creative at heart. That pathway was a bit of a rebellious one to get there, in contrast with the cues from my parents. And yeah, who am I? I'm just me, I guess. It's
Ah.
yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about the cues of your parents.
Well, my dad was quite a linear guy. He was a smart man, but very much he grew up quite oppressed by his parents, or certainly his father, who was a militaristic guy and never really gave him the space to explore himself a whole lot. But my dad was an accountant type of person. He always told me growing up, you must be in marketing or business. That's the only path. That's the only choice you have. And I was like, okay. And when I was really young, I kind of latched onto that and would speak about it in a way just to get his approval. But at high school, I was pulled into the school musical, and at that point, the school I went to didn't have a decent drama department or theatre department or arts department for that matter. And the year that I was in matric, my final year, we got a new music teacher who came in and decided that he was going to feed the school with a little bit of cultural juice. And I got pulled into being the lead in a musical. When I was a kid, I used to sing a lot, and I did that. It was really amazing to do it. I was always a very sporty kind of person. So
Can I ask what musical?
it was Godspell, actually. So I was Jesus. But it was an interesting moment for me because being very sporty, maybe you could say a jock, I guess, but I was very sporty and very passionate about sport, in particular rugby and water polo. And that won the approval of peers and teachers and certainly my father as well. But when I got pulled into this musical, my father wasn't really that impressed with it. And I got the approval and different kinds of interactions from people that I otherwise didn't at the school. Mm-hmm. And so it gave me access to a wider spectrum of people, which was really cool. And I really enjoyed it. So when I went to university, again, my father was business and marketing. That's what you got to study. And sure enough, I've signed up for those classes. And then I also signed up for drama as an extra subject. And I remember my father, why are you wasting your time with that? And that became the subject I poured most of my energy and attention into because it fulfilled me in a way that the others didn't. And so I ended up having an extra major in drama for my undergrad and then left South Africa when I was about 24 after my father had immigrated to the States. And that kind of set me on the trajectory where I am now.
So what about your mother?
My mom my parents got divorced when I was about 14. And so at that point, I ended up living with my father. My siblings lived with my mom for other reasons. And so my mom wasn't really ever allowed to work. She wasn't encouraged to work while they were together. So when they got divorced, my mom, instead of being able to follow her creative impulses, I think if we get certain traits from our parents, then I definitely got my creative impulses from my mom. That was already in her genes and in her family. But she had to get work and sustain herself in a way that was possible and viable. So she never really got to explore her creative side a lot, which she really encouraged me all the time. So I got that support from my mom.
Right. I see. So your mother, but how did you see the creativity in your mother? I mean, what did she do?
My mom would she was kind of like a magpie, which I like to do as well. She would always be collecting things from the beach or in the forest and come home and arrange them and put them together in little beautiful arrangements and then stick them on a backing and then put it on the wall and move it around in different ways. And so interior design was something she always wanted to do. So she always had that kind of eye for an aesthetic and in a beautiful small way would fuel that. And
I have a mom like that, and so also quite similar in a sense, although in a Dutch context. But she, she's now 80. 80. Yeah, she's going to be 80 in a few months. And she is also from a generation where, when she had children, this is a weird thing that actually happened. She worked as a nurse, but then she got married, and then she was called into her boss's office when it was known that she was going to get married. And the conversation went like, "Oh, we're so sorry to see you go." Like, what? Because a married woman is not working. We were like, what? So, and she actually did want to, but she didn't. She also comes from a very creative family, but creativity, and making money, it wasn't such an easy thing. But interior design was also her passion. But what would also meant that every time I would come home, something was changed in the house. And after a while, I didn't even notice. So like the couch would be in a different place, and I would just sit down and, do my thing. And she said, "What do you think?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Because it changed every time. But it's kind of, And she also never was able to really, she did some creative work, but not like, she didn't really kind of reach her potential, if you know what I mean. But it's kind of
kind of like you make do with the materials that you have at your disposal, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just go and she still does actually do some painting, and but to me it was an example also, and maybe I don't know if that's for you the same, that I look at my mother and think, she didn't really get to that kind of really, use her creativity and make a life out of that. I don't want that. For myself, I are like, no, I'm not gonna compromise. I really want to go there. Is that similar for you?
Well, I think so. Definitely. I agree. The same for me with my mom. I see my mom never got the chance to fulfill her creative potential and to explore her creative side. And I think we're lucky in our generation that we're able to be liberated from the constraints and the fear and the ways in which our parents had to make decisions, or the context within which they had to make decisions. Certainly in South Africa, and there was a set way in which you fulfill the role that you have and been prescribed as a mother or a wife or whatever. So I cannot compromise being who I am and following my creative impulses. Yes, it's important to make decisions that make them sustainable or viable. When I came back to South Africa, 15 years ago, for example, off the back of all these incredible theater experiences, I realized that I came back here and suddenly was filled with the fear of being a starving artist, because the way people sustain themselves in South Africa and the possibility to sustain themselves in the ways that I was doing in Europe didn't exist here. And so that fear of being in a place where often creative pursuits aren't as are not as valued in society as perhaps they were in the Renaissance period, But certainly that's always been a bit of a balancing act for me, and to manage that fear of not succeeding or not being able to be creative. And I never wanted to be creative, be forced to be creative and have to be creative to make money. And this act has to be a financial outcome. And that, I think, is stifling. Sometimes that those two are not incongruent. And that's kind of the goal, I guess, for it to be financially viable, because I don't think there's any reason why we can't be creative and thrive financially. But certainly I'm, I think like all of us, we're looking just to fulfill our creative talents and discover them as much as possible.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you were, from South Africa and then left for some time, then are now back in South Africa. What were you doing in those years that you were not?
Well, my father actually immigrated to the States when I was, I think, my second year university undergrad, and he moved to Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. And
you did that accent very well.
Yeah. And so I actually, when I finished my undergrad, I went over to the States with the idea of perhaps living there and being with him. And I realized very shortly after that I wasn't going to stay there. And I said to him after 2 weeks, look, I'm going to go back to Europe, because I'd been in Europe a month before I went to the States. That was my initiation into the rest of the world. And I Yeah, so I left America after 6 months. South Carolina is not exactly the most exciting part of America. It's very particular. It's the Bible Belt, and it's very conservative, and it just wasn't my thing. And so when I went, but while I was in the States, I met a Norwegian woman, a Norwegian girl, and we fell in love. And she went back to Norway, and I came back after 6 months to visit her, and ended up in Norway. As I say in Norway, you either come to Norway for oil or love.
Exactly. Yes, I know this. Yes.
Yeah. No, Anna, you spent some
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Also because of a girl. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But also a beautiful country. Beautiful. To me, at least at that time, I still think it's a beautiful language. But also, I was also really interested in music at the time. So I was playing in a band, and I really wanted to kind of explore music. And Norwegian music, there's something like traditional music. There's something interesting about that because it goes. I mean, there's like it has connections to Scottish and Irish music, and so to me it was really fascinating to kind of go into music. But then when I was there, so I went to folk high school. And in Seljord, which is in Telemark, which is like in the middle of it's beautiful, amazing nature, very small town. But I was going to that school studying music and Norwegian. But then I saw other kids who also were at the school who were doing something else, and they were doing friluftsliv, outdoor sports and stuff like that, and they would come back with the Huskies dogs and going to the mountains, and I was like, what am I doing? Like, what I want to do what they are doing. So I switched, and I thought, no, I'm going to kind of learn how to navigate in the mountains. That's what I'm going to do. So to me, Norway is a country which I'm not used to as a Dutch person. It was my first kind of experience of being in a country where you could get lost completely. Yeah, like, and no one will ever find you again, because there's only like 4 million Norwegians in a huge country with mountains and, nature. And I was like, I could just walk up, this mountain and just keep walking up north. I won't meet anyone, and I will never be found.
Yeah. But it's actually a very big country. I don't think people realize how big it is.
Yeah, it goes all the way up to Russia, which is like really narrow, but it's kind of, how did they get that country anyway? How do they say, yeah, you keep that little, like, why do the Swedes and the Finns say, yeah, you get that little narrow strip of, because probably nobody wanted it. They're like, why would you want to be up there? But it's huge.
75% of Norway is uninhabitable.
Yeah.
Just because of the geography, as you say. So it's very, very sparsely populated. And as you say, it's a long country, but at the bottom, it's kind of like a tadpole. It's got the head at the bottom, and then the tail runs all the way to the top. Beautiful country. Probably the most beautiful country in the world I've ever been to. I'm always speaking about Norway and the beauty of Norway with such awe. And it's incredible. Beautiful.
Yeah. But we, so the difference between cultures, and before I press record, we talked a little bit about this. I'm really interested in the fact that, you started, living in Norway for a long time. So my experience in Norwegian as a Dutch person, which is also not the same as a South African person, obviously, I thought they were very difficult to how to say that, to become real friends. So I was at a school, I lived at the campus, and so there were like 80 students, and I think 60 were Norwegians and 20 were people from all over the world. I made like 20 friends. Oh no, 21, and one of them was a Norwegian.
One of them, oh boy.
Like real friend, like, because they were very individualistic. But also you're a foreigner. When you're a foreigner, you're a foreigner. But it's not just they're not nationalistic in sort of a sense that we kind of familiar with. They also wanted you. So if I would kind of be critical about the Netherlands, which Dutch people always are, is it shit country? They didn't want that hear that. They were like, you should be proud of your country. They were like nationalistic, but they felt that everyone should be, at least the way I kind of. But to me, it's like this weird kind of being so proud of your country, and Norwegian flags everywhere with Christmas, like the Christmas tree, or all Norwegian flags. And I was like, what's going on? You're crazy.
They decorate their Christmas trees and their national flag.
Yeah. There's flag everywhere. Every opportunity they have, their Norwegian flag is there.
Well, I mean, it's the same could be said about America, for example.
Sure. Yeah, too. But for a Dutch person, it was like, I'm allergic to these things. I'm like, crazy. So culturally, there was a big difference, but also in the way, how people kind of let you into their home, really, or their heart, if you will. So how did you experience that as opposed to being living in South Africa?
Well, I will say this from the outset, though. Obviously, I grew to love Norwegians and understand the culture, but in the beginning, it wasn't like that. Of course, love brought me to Norway, but we didn't stay together, and essentially, Norwegians and the beauty kept me there. In the beginning, it was I would judge everything that was different from what I understood and was used to. I was a young man; I hadn't been exposed to the world much at all, and so. If someone, a small example, I remember on the very first night I arrived in Norway, and my girlfriend at the time took me to a bar. And in fact, that bar was called Garage, which is still there to this day. 1 week before I arrived, Nirvana, the band, had just gone global. They went huge, but they were going to be playing in that bar that night.
Really?
By a week.
Whoa.
But I remember standing and talking to my partner and my girlfriend, and a friend of hers arrived and walked in and started talking to her. So the three of us are standing together. And I, in my culture, it's completely normal. It's so rude if you don't go, oh, by the way, this is Colin and this is Peter or whatever his name is. And that didn't happen at all. So I stood there waiting for the introduction to happen, and it never happened. Eventually, I had to kind of introduce myself. And he looked at me a little bit strangely, like, okay, yeah, whatever. And so I thought that's really weird. I thought this is rude, And so those types of interactions happened for quite a long period of time. And I had to temper myself because I realized I was becoming triggered by it. But eventually, of course, I realized that this is just a different way, a different lens, a different way of being and expressing culture. And I'm the one losing out if I become frustrated by it. And it wasn't really fair to judge just foreign culture without understanding and knowing it. And so I actually set myself a task of learning the language as well as I possibly could. And in that way, I also recruited local Norwegians to help me learn the language. So I had one or two sentences that I had figured out, like, in Norwegian, I'd say, it's fine if you laugh at me, but please correct me or please help me. Or if they started speaking English when I was stumbling through Norwegian, I'd say, I want to learn Norwegian. Can you just speak in Norwegian? And they'd be really happy to do that. And I think that helped me understand them a lot more, because I realized that they, in the small ways that when you start assimilating into culture and you start understanding more and more through the language and through time, that it's just different. And judging a culture based on what you don't understand yet, I think is shorting yourself and everyone else.
But that's a really important mindset. I think you learn when you travel, especially when you live in other countries, even if it's just for a few months or so. But because later in life, especially if you start working on international projects, you start realizing that it's you should approach these things with curiosity. Right? It's like, hey, this is interesting. Instead of saying this is weird, this is stupid, you go like, this is interesting. Like, why? I don't understand this. I want to know. Like, tell me. I have that all the time, like in Asia and also in Norway. Like, I started working in Norway years later. Not too long ago. I was doing these projects, and I remember having a meeting. And so I'm in a room, and there's people in the meeting room, and I'm sort of in the back, and people coming in because it's a big meeting and a big table. No one comes to me, shakes my hand. They don't come over. They don't come over. I'm like, in my culture, we shake hands with everyone. Like, you need to kind of say hello to everyone in the room, but no one. And I was like, do I now go approach them? Like, am I going over because I have to kind of really get past a lot of people? And like, because I know, like, those little things, and you go like, is this a cultural thing, or am I just missing something? Like, something I just don't know. And like,
Yeah.
maybe they're confused, or am I confused? Who's confused? Are we all confused? I don't know. So I kind of learned to kind of be curious about that, and then try to find out and just ask. So like, is this something that you do? Or is this normal, or am I? Oh, it's really interesting. That's fascinating. Like, but being sort of, being lost in translation, kind of, right? It's such a great place to be as well.
Sometimes you learn the hard way. I remember once I went to a bar right in the beginning, and there were 5 or 6 people that were all friends. And in South Africa, if you go up to the bar, it's normal. You buy around for everyone. Sure, everything's cheaper in South Africa.
Yeah, exactly.
Buy around. You don't just go to the bar and buy your own beer and come back and everyone goes. So naturally, I'm doing the calculations. Like there's 5 or 6 people. I've got just enough money to buy everyone a beer. That's fine. They'll all buy me a beer later. So I go to the bar, buy around for everyone. And first of all, I ask, who wants a beer? Yeah, I'll have one. I'll have one. I buy 5 beers, give it to everyone, and then I'm going, it's fine. Everyone will buy me one later. And the first person finishes their beer, they stand up and go to the bar and buy their own beer and come back. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Go and buy their own beer. No one buys me a beer. Now I got no more
You're
money.
broke.
Last time I do that.
Exactly. Yeah. So Morgan, I'm pretty sure you have some experiences.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I was also like, because you mentioned the being lost in translation, and there's also kind of a beauty in that, because you're not expected to know all of the cultures or all of the customs or traditions, right? Like, okay, yeah, sure, you ended up with maybe some less beer that night, but then you could still, there's still some beauty in saying, hey, I'm new here, I don't fully understand. And I think that's what I also really love about being in a different culture, is that I can always, in a way, fall back on, okay, well, I wasn't born and raised in the Netherlands, so of course there's still going to be things I don't yet understand. And I also really appreciate that about traveling, because it kind of gives me a little bit more cushion to be myself in a way, while also interacting. So also what you mentioned about the being on the fringes, but then diving into the chaos. I don't know. There's a nice, that's what I really love about traveling and being in new cultures. So.
Well, travel gives you a different options, right? And it gives you sort of first of all, shows you that your way of thinking and is not like it's not common. It's not like everyone sees the world the same way. Your reality is not everyone else's reality. And so this idea of options, like, oh, this is also, you can live like this too. You can also act like this. It's not the same everywhere, and it's still their reality. And so it breaks kind of down your bubble, if you will, which sometimes is really uncomfortable, because you're like, you are lost, and you're like, but if you then approach it with curiosity, if you have that opportunity, at least, you go like, I'm interested. And to your point, Colin, so asking people to teach you, I've learned that people really love to do that. If you are saying, I'm curious about your culture, but I don't know, can you teach me? Or your language, can you show me? Can you teach me? People actually love that.
Yeah. And I love what you said, Morgan, as well, about traveling to foreign places, especially if it's an extended period of time with an opportunity to kind of sink into the culture a little bit. I love that feeling of anonymity, where I can create myself, I can present a version of myself and explore that. And no one has any expectations of who I am or what I do. The extreme of that is I could just completely fabricate who I am. But short of that is I really love exactly like Anna asked, who are you? Like, how do I present myself to this person who has no idea who I am, knows nothing about my culture? And that was always interesting, because I began to, and more and more I traveled, began to explore and discover different versions and aspects of myself. And I think that's what travel does, is it exposes us to external differences and different cultures and different permutations of the ways in which people organize themselves and live. And I think it's an education that can't be replicated, really.
And I think it's a dynamic, because of course I have a friend who who hates flying, so just says, I don't need to travel, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
and is a bit grouchy about traveling, but just says, oh, I'll just watch a lot of movies and go to museums and have great conversations with other people in town and learn how they live, which can also bring you new insights. Oh, you can do this with your life, or oh, you can live like that. But I think also in that combination with being able to reinvent yourself, I think that's a really powerful duo there, right? Because you can go on a trip and say, okay, this time I'm going to be the really quiet, observant Colin, or maybe this time I want to be the really outgoing, performative Colin, or
yeah, no, exactly. I think it takes it's easy to be comfortable and by yourself in a place that you're familiar with at home, etc. But to find yourself in a place that's anonymous where you don't know anyone, suddenly to be confronted with maybe the feelings of insecurity or loneliness, or these types of the extremes of the emotion, the human condition, I think is quite exhilarating actually. And I also don't think that traveling needs to be for everyone. I think as you described, for some people, if there's an impulse to travel, I think it's worth exploring it. If there's no impulse to travel, then that's perfect for where you are as well. There's a lot of traveling that can be done I can walk around my garden and travel the whole day and discover things that I've never seen before. And
yeah.
But certainly travel's been a big part of my life, and I'm so grateful for those opportunities, especially while everyone else was building a career. I was trying to save up for my next air ticket.
And you mentioned the different like versions of yourself. Is there one version of yourself that you're diving into more lately?
Interesting. The version of myself that I've been most committed to in the last 15 years is being a father. So I have a 15-year-old daughter, and the journey of being a father is amazing. In the beginning, it was really difficult to suddenly come to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to. Well, it was a choice that I made, of course, but I wouldn't be able to just up and leave and travel by an impulse or follow through on an invitation. And that became kind of the habitual way of I was moving in the world. That was the default in many ways. I didn't feel comfortable staying in one place for far too long. Suddenly becoming a father was a whole nother aspect of myself, and actually became a very rooting, grounding experience for me. In retrospect, probably very productive, and I'm grateful for that as well. And so with that, with my daughter becoming a little bit older now, I'm starting to go, that Colin that I used to play with. And I know I've seen aspects of him here and there, and yes, he's still alive, but starting to kind of give wind a little bit to that flight in some way.
Yeah. I recognize that. My daughter it's her birthday today. Actually, she's turning 17. She's 17 now.
Happy birthday!
Yeah, which is
What's her name?
Julia.
Okay, cool.
So she's 17. So I am reminded by that the day that she was born, obviously, just today.
Is she your oldest?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have a son. He's 11. So he's yeah. So sorry. I was thinking like when you have kids, things change obviously on the practical side as well. There's but it's the same with like we have a dog. It's also like, oh my God, he's going to be with us for at least 15 years or longer. We need to walk him every day. This is a mistake. But kids, it's not a mistake, but it's still like, okay, you need to take care of them, of course, which of course I want to, but at the same time, like you said, it changes your life, the pattern of things, and also the things you want to do. So the balance changes, but learning about yourself, that's not a good reason to have children, by the way, just to learn to like learn more about myself, but it happens. I remember. So maybe do you have that same experience? So the way I experienced when my daughter was born, I remembered she was born, and then right then at that moment I was a dad. I don't know, something changed. Like it was like boom, it was a baby. They gave she was born in a hospital, which in the Netherlands is not, it's not that, because my son was born at home. We do these home births, which I do not recommend, by the way, because it's like, why do we like? Well, it was happening. We're like, why do we do this? This is go to a hospital, please. No, anyway, my daughter was born in a hospital because she was late and she didn't want to come out, and she still is, by the way. Yeah, and anyway, they gave the baby to us, which felt like that. Yeah, like, here's your baby. After they measured her and weighed her and checked if she was okay. We got the baby, and then they just send us home, and we're like, are they just let us go? They're just going to let us go with the baby? Like, I don't know. I think
Where's the manual?
Yeah, where's the manual? Oh my God! Like, they
What
just.
now?
Is someone going to, join us, or like give us some training? It felt so vulnerable, so fragile. It was so fragile, and it was such a hot day. It was the hottest day of the year, and we learned that you have to kind of have like you had that little hat on and blankets and keep the baby warm. But it was like really hot that day. We're like, are we still doing this? I don't know. This is too hot? I don't know. She can't talk. No clue. We're completely lost. But that feeling of like, oh, there's this little being and it's so fragile and all of it. I know it switched something in my
And of course, you mentioned as your daughter was born, but I think for women there's 9 months of being being inside of them with everything. It's preparation for a woman in a way that a man doesn't have.
No, I can't.
It's not tangible. And as soon as that baby is born, something clicked and shifts exactly as you described.
You're like, I have to do something now.
I don't know the clue what I'm doing. Still don't know what I'm doing, but
yeah. You've been having the baby in your belly for like so long, and now I'm like, you take care of it. You know what to do. It's true. It's true. I can't use I think for men, you can't imagine how that, even the possibility is even like that it could be like a being inside of you growing. Anyway, it's such a weird thing. But anyway, now they're growing up. They're becoming teenagers. Which also changes things. And I tell my daughter, like, every time we have an issue, which happens quite often nowadays, because she wants to be free and do things. And I'm like, no, you're my little, I have to protect you. You're like, don't protect me. I'm like, but that's my job. So I keep telling her, like, I don't know what to do. You're the first teenage daughter I have had. I don't have that experience. I've never been a dad of a teenage daughter before.
Yeah.
How do I know? There's no manual. There's books, but they don't tell me really what to do in the kind of at the moment. So I'm so, sometimes really lost.
Yeah, I kind of feel at this age, she's now a teenager going on 16. My role is more to, certainly as a dad, is just to be the sort of soft padding on the edge of the room. And let her play and run around and bounce around. And, I'm there if she gets to the edges and needs a little bit of support. And it's a critical role, even though I'm not affirmed or acknowledged as much as I'd like to, The hugs are not as forthcoming, but that might shift again.
Yeah. That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah. I try to do the same. Yeah. No.
And Arna, because you have 2 kids, and Colin, you have 1 daughter?
I have 1 daughter, correct.
Okay. So Arna, you mentioned like, okay, this is the first time you're being a father to a teenage daughter, but do you notice then like the same milestones? And of course your son is very different than your daughter just because that's how humans work. But do you notice that you feel a bit more comfortable then with some of the things because you've already experienced them before?
Well, so my daughter, this happens like probably every week. My daughter will say, when I was his age, I was not allowed to do that.
I'm the oldest child. We're the great experiment. It's infuriating. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Isn't it? Yeah. It must be like, but even being aware of it as a parent, it's and obviously because he's a boy, she will say, "Is it because he's a boy?" And we go like, I think so. I don't know. Maybe it is. I don't know. I can't remember. When I was 11, I could not go by myself to this place. And he can just go alone. Like, and you know, I was like, I can't remember that anymore. I don't know. It's like, couldn't you? Yeah. So yeah, for sure. Yeah. So being the oldest one, I think is, yeah, you are kind of the pioneer and you're kind of stretching the boundaries. And we go like, with him, we go like, yeah, fine. You know, when can I come home? Anytime.
I'm the oldest of three, and we're all like 2 years apart, so quite a close. But you can see like the waves of like, okay, more strict. Like this is exactly how we do. The middle child is more like, okay, we loosen up. Okay, we still and then the last child is just, yeah, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but you can tell, like, if you're the younger. So I have a sister, she's 3 years older than I, but she, for instance, she tried to fight for a few things that she really wanted to have. Like, but my father was like, no, you can't have that. And so I kind of like, I didn't even fight for that. Or like, nah, I don't need a moped, you know,
Yeah.
and I'm like, no. All right, fine. You know, I didn't even consider that because I already knew the way my parents responded to my daughter, to my sister.
Yeah.
So I think I think I see that in my son as well, that he goes like, all right, I'm going to lose that battle. So I'm not going there. So I'll go
Maybe
there.
that's what's happening. That's maybe they're like using the prototype of the older child to figure out where
they go like, okay, this is exactly here. I can kind of can get this done. Maybe this, maybe no, not that. They're smarter because they know they've seen it, right? Yeah. So Colin, do you have any brothers, sisters?
I have an older brother and older sister, so I'm the youngest. So as you said, my parents made all the mistakes with them, and then I came.
Are they in marketing?
No, they're not. My brother's a teacher. My sister, he lives in Venezuela, and my sister actually lives in the States.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no one went into marketing.
No one went into marketing or business, much to my father's dismay.
Yeah.
Well, I did go into business, but many years later, even after all my theater experiences and education, and when I started a business, he said to me, "It's good to see you finally gotten serious about life."
Oh no!
What are you talking about?
Tell me about your theater experiences, because I think that's been that had such a big impact on who you became or who you are now, right? So your theater, I think, if I think about you, theater to me is like a big thing. Like that's so connected to you in so many different ways. And I'm not meaning literally the theater and being in a play, but just theater, storytelling, that kind of and having, and also your stage personality, your the way I think you position yourself as well, at least the way I see you. The theater in a bigger sense is such a big part of who you are. So can you talk a little bit about what your theater experience was and what you did?
Well, as I said, I left South Africa with an undergrad in industrial psychology and business administration, and then with drama as an extra major. And wasn't quite sure where I was going to go with it, what I was going to do. Went to the States, and then ended up coming to Norway. And then I began to pursue an interest in theater in Norway, which kind of fell through, and I lost interest for various reasons. Slightly disillusioned by the institutionalized way of theater and quite a kind of linear way of doing theater, and wasn't exposed to the right impulses. And then ended up doing lots of other things. I did a degree in comparative politics in Norway, et cetera. But then my interest in theater was reinvigorated by meeting my Russian teacher, and I started becoming more and more involved in what's called the European Association for Theater Culture, and I was exposed to a whole new paradigm, a whole new way of creating theater, a philosophy in theater that I wasn't exposed to before. And it suddenly was, wow, okay, it's kind of like traveling in the world of theater. And suddenly, hey, different ways in which I could do this. And I'd never really been, at that point, I'd seen myself as maybe an actor in theater and a performer, not even the word performer, just as an actor. And suddenly I realized that there's other roles within theater that better serve me or kind of are calling me or are more aligned with who I am, and specifically as a theater director, but also in this experimental way of approaching theater making traditions, the physical theater. And so this started a whole journey of travel around the world, both for admittedly hedonistic purposes, but a lot of the time, and most of the time, doing theater research and exploring anthropological forms of theater and performance, a lot in the East, in the ways that theater and performance is integrated in society. I mean, I can think of Bali in India. I spent 8 months in Japan studying the oldest form of theater in the world and a contemporary form called Buto. And all these experiences really, really ignited a whole new aesthetic, or at least an impulse to follow a different path. And so the theater making traditions became a big part of the way I was developing myself as an artist and a creative. I very influenced by the Russian approach to theater making. I remember my teacher talking about there was a story he told how at the time, you're saying 80, 90 years ago, the director and producer in theater didn't exist yet. And the performers, the ensemble, had the responsibility for the whole theater making process. They held all the autonomy for creating the roles, the scripting, organizing the rehearsals, for the directing, for creating this performance and manifesting on stage. And then the director and producer were invented. And in the East, not in the East, sorry, in the West, he talks about how a lot of ensembles gave away and actors gave away their autonomy to the director and producer, and these roles were elevated. And suddenly you had a breakdown of the ensemble, and these individual actors would go to directors and say, please hire me, please hire me. Whereas in Russia, that didn't happen. The director had equal status to performers, and performers held their autonomy. And more importantly, the ensembles remained cohesive and held their autonomy. And so directors would come to ensembles and say, please hire me, please hire me. And so directors but the performers also were responsible for exploring and discovering and coming up with ways in which text could be interpreted. And that happened by themselves. When they came back to rehearsals, it was to show and share what they discovered, not the director saying, let's do this now, do that. And so a director's role became more of a facilitator. So there was this blending of facilitator director. And in the theater making process, 10% of what happens in theater is on the stage. There's so much that happens behind the scenes and in the preparation, in the ways of working, the training of the instrument. And so this blending of director and facilitator really caught my attention. And when I returned to South Africa with the intention 15 years ago to consolidate these years of travel in a master's, which I did do, my kind of intention was to explore where this blending of facilitator and director would take me. In fact, the day that I was standing in the queue to register for my master's in dramatic art in Wits in Durban, I called my girlfriend at the time and said, look, I'm standing in the queue now to register. This is the final day. If you knew you were pregnant, would you still encourage me to register? Because we were waiting to get the results. And I registered in that night. She called, and that night we got the phone call and said, you're pregnant, so you're going to become a father. So I was thrown into that headspace. The day that I registered for my master's, suddenly I was going to be a father. I thought, how the hell am I going to make this financially viable or sustainable? And so I started a dual route, and I became an entrepreneur as well. And I've worn two hats since: the route of facilitator, theater person, and also as an entrepreneur. And that's been, and then my journey pivoted during that master's into the applied space and began to explore myself as a facilitator in organizational contexts, various contexts, but with the theater director facilitator hat on.
Which is something I've, theater and facilitation is something that is you see that quite often. People who have experience in theater, or I myself have also a theater experience.
Hmm.
To me, having been on stage, for instance, is such a huge influence on me as a facilitator. Being able to understand sort of the dynamics of your stage personality, and being able to kind of read the audience, if you know what I mean, and sort of kind of that feeling of the energy in a room, but also being vulnerable, and knowing how to be vulnerable and how to kind of do that. I think theater is such a. I always advise everyone who wants to be a facilitator, to go do theater, improv, even better. It's something that do something that you don't even can't even predict it's going to happen. So I think it's just such a powerful now sort of. It's such a logical combination. It's like, yeah, duh, of course you do. But I can imagine that at that time that wasn't, right? Because that's kind of relatively kind of a new awareness, at least that I have. Like, yeah, lots of people who are in facilitation or are really good at it have some kind of experience in some form of theater, some way.
Yeah.
But how did you kind of, was there a moment where you go like, these skills are actually, in a business context, these are really, really useful?
Yeah. Well, when I initially, I knew just from a place of wisdom. In other words, through the experience that I had, that there's a whole trove of intelligence that I've learned in terms of my ability to navigate my own internal somatic space, the ways in which we theater people can explore and interact with others in space, and work in ways that I knew were not normal for people that aren't exposed to theater. Look, anyone in theater will go through years and years of training, which invariably means shedding the layers of inhibitions and shedding layers of resistance to working in these kinds of ways. But essentially in theater, and I can track my journey, and I guess anybody will be able to track that journey. And I mean, there were moments when I would be in the middle of a deep process somewhere in exotic, and I would suddenly be a fly on the wall and almost be my dad's persona going, what the hell's going on here? This looks like a cult. And I would be
Yeah,
a little bit
exactly.
self-conscious for a moment, and then I'd think, oh, this is incredible. And I'd be so grateful and just dive straight into it again. And so in those moments, I did not have to evaluate the value of this work in the context of society and getting a job. It was just what I was doing, and I was immersed in it, and it was in the moment, and it was really, really rich. But so when I came back to South Africa and started with intention to apply this work in organizational spaces, I didn't know how to talk about it in a way that would have traction, in a way that could express the value it had to offer for people in business. I was still formulating it for myself. All I understood was intuitively that there was something really profoundly valuable about this way of working, and certainly and my journey was to find a way to talk about it and to express it and make it accessible, and that is still my journey. And I think I've come quite a long way, but I've got a long way to go still. I actually in the beginning shied away from even using the word theater. So even if I'm bringing methods or techniques from the theater, I would try to not talk about it as theater, because I noticed that as soon as I use the word theater, there's an assumption that I'm going to be standing on stage and entertaining you now, and you're going to sit back. And so in the applied theater space, people like Auguste Boal with all of his work in forum theater, terms like spectactor, where you're blending spectator and actor, where you're closing the gap between the invisible curtain, standing on stage, and a passive audience, where actually you're bringing the two together. And so allowing people to have experiences that can then be reflected back into the rational, into the work they're doing, I saw as a way of accessing the potential in terms of embodied intelligence and embodied awareness, and expanding the ways in which we perceive the world and the ways in which we think and then act on the world.
So I don't know enough about theater to have a really deep conversation about it with you. But there is I somewhere, I think there's a Russian form of theater, and maybe that's also what you were talking about, where you actually don't have that fourth kind of wall, right? Between, so where actually the audience is shown a situation that they are are being asked to kind of agree or disagree with, or to kind of fix or not, or so there's like a they were shown, and I think it's also something in South America, kind of a form of you're being shown you're like a industrial, CEO, director, and then the workers, there's a revolution going on or something on stage, and everybody's in the audience kind of participates in this kind of scene. So again, I don't know enough about this, but that blending of sort of these two kind of, which in sort of in Western, like, theater, that's not what you do. You, as an audience, you sit and you watch, and you're expected to applaud at the end. But is that something that also is that something you have experience with, or is that also part of that Russian philosophy?
Yeah, well, certainly not only Russian, but all over the world. I know, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but certainly what comes up to mind is invisible theater, for example, which again was one of Augusta Boal's ways of working, where the audience would they would invariably become an audience without knowing it. So, for example, I remember one story was in Sweden. There was some kind of a law passed around a pregnancy. I can't remember what it was, some kind of a maternal law. And there was quite a hoo-ha. The society weren't all that happy around it. And Augusta Boal went to the troupe, and on a ferry boat, one woman was pretending to be pregnant, had a big fake kind of pregnant belly, and her husband got into a very loud argument, fake argument, and it pulled in some people who didn't realize it was actually an act into this argument, and they started arguing, and everybody started having this wild kind of raucous engagement, and then the actors just kind of slinked away. And so that's kind of one example of what maybe you're talking about. But certainly people like the Poor Theatre, Grotowski, who was a very famous Polish director, he said, if you take everything away, take away the props, take away the lighting, take away the clothing, the costume, the script, everything, what are you left with? Well, you're left with just the human body. This is the Poor Theatre. He used to have audiences positioned in the middle of the performance. So you'd walk in, there were chairs everywhere, and the actors would perform around them all over the place. Obviously, you're a performer then. But this idea of bringing, of allowing the spectators to be performers and actors in the process themselves. This is where, such as in role play, and then to be able to reflect on what you're doing became really useful and valuable tools and techniques that offer value in more facilitated spaces, creative processes and contexts, etc. And so I think, theatre reflects life, it reflects society, and the ability to reflect our conversations through performative methods and means, I think is extremely valuable. This additional lens. Performance studies has become an umbrella term, a genre of studies under which theatre is one, popularized by Richard Schechner from New York University. But to seeing the world through the lens of performance, and that's been really useful for me. Everything is a performance, actually. When we're standing on a stage, when we're interacting with our friends, if you go to a cafe and you sort of just hang out in the periphery and observe people and see them as a performance, something really interesting happens, because then you start to notice the way people carry themselves, their physicality, you notice their smiles, you can start reading into their interactions, you can read into how close they are, how familiar, what kind of, you can make assumptions about the affections between them, and there's so much that we can read through that lens of performance. And I think that's what theatre offers as a complement to the more rational ways of perceiving and being in the world.
Which somehow connects to this idea that of you, if you go into a new culture and you see things as a performance, instead of saying, hey, it's weird, it's not supposed to happen this way. If you look at it as performance, you can analyze it and start to kind of you see things differently. It's a different lens of looking at sort of situations that you're in. So it's really interesting kind of way of thinking.
And we also perform our cultures, we perform our identities, we perform, we perform what we're exploring. We perform our interactions and engagements by virtue of our being in a physical body, acting upon the world and behaving in certain ways, saying things. And so everything really is performed. And I think it's a really, it's kind of like, putting on one of those 3D glasses at the cinema, and you put on these completely new lenses and frames, and suddenly the world just pops.
I was going to ask, because this is, you can make you're talking about these different lenses and frames and ways of looking, which also gives a really nice space to people, because then it gives them the space to reflect on it. And so did you know, because you also mentioned that when you started this study was the same moment you also put on the entrepreneur hat. Did you start with facilitation and doing these things and bringing the magic of theater and all that it offers to organizations, or did it take you a long time to figure out, hey, these tools would actually be really useful in an alternative context?
Well, I'd already been running sort of theater training or experiences with performers and actors, certainly in Tokyo and before. So having creatives or performers in a room and then taking them through these different experiences, these different journeys. And so facilitating those kinds of moments was something I was already doing. I had to learn to dumb it down a little bit, in the beginning, especially in organizational spaces. I noticed, I was very surprised. People just did not because they lacked intelligence for it, just because we make different choices in our lives, and some people just were not exposed to those years of peeling back the layers of inhibition. And so sometimes the smallest things would have profound impact on people. And so learning to build those bridges between my own the intelligence that I understood in my own body, but what I lacked to articulate rationally, and where I was coming from, or where people were, is this journey that I've been on. And so different contexts offer different opportunities to do that. And I made, and I still do, made many mistakes around it, and had to kind of continue peeling away those layers of inhibitions and feeling self-conscious and making judgments about myself and whether this work was effective or whether I was just kind of fooling myself, et cetera, et cetera. But I think
that will never end. That will never end. I think that is life. I think that is what it is, right? Being able to kind of observe yourself and say, there's something you said earlier, which I'm curious whether it is something that you also feel is true. You said, you at one point you kind of all of a sudden you're flying a wall and you think, oh my God, I'm in a cult or something, and that's your father. Is that because, and again, I mean, I can only relate to things that are similar to me, because to me, I have a father who's more like the sort of the scientist, basically. He was worked in labs. You're a rational person, and my mother's very creative. But I have these two voices in my head. I think helps me sometimes to create that bridge, to be so your father being also that voice in your head saying, this might look really weird to people like your father. So you need to kind of be able to bridge that, but if you grew up with that voice, that might help you to recognize that it might be a bit far out for some people. With theater might be a bit weird and a bit exotic. So you can, what you said, dumb it down, or kind of change your language a little bit, so having a more natural ability to have empathy for people who come from a business background, a more linear background, if you will. Is that something that might be true?
Yeah, first of all, I think dumb it down maybe is not the right way to phrase it. It's more like to temper it and to strategically design it in a way that is of value and will meet the audience where they're at. And I think that has required me to gain a better understanding of where people are positioned, where they are. and so that I could bring it position in a way that's of value. I think my father's voice was often riddled with fear. It was came from a fear-based place. You're not going to have enough when you're older. You got to save for pension, and and also he didn't understand. He promoted what he understood and what was safe and familiar for him, and that was his journey. And I think he projected that onto me, and I'm sure the intention was always to protect me, and he wants what's best for me. So in a way, I think he kept reminding me that we all have our own journey, and I need to be true to my own impulses and trust that what I'm following is aligned in some way, and not to judge the outcome and judge the success of that based on what my father would judge it as. And that's also, I think, a lifelong journey. But I've come a little bit further down the path, and I don't grapple with those things so more. It's more a case of how to continue framing and molding this work in a way that supports my growth and brings value to people I engage with.
What are you doing right now that is, that makes you most happy besides your daughter? But work-wise, what is the thing that you're doing right now that you're most excited about?
I'm really excited about, I guess they call it the Extended Mind Project. I'm excited about this idea, this way of how do we extend our intelligence. Annie Murphy-Paul wrote a book recently called The Extended Mind, which was this concept of extended mind was off an article that Andy Clark wrote. Is that we are intelligent beings, but not only by virtue of having a brain and a mind, but our intelligence extends beyond just the cerebral lump. We are intelligent by virtue of this physicality, our living, breathing, sensing beings. And I think that coming from the theater space, this idea of extended mind obviously makes not only sense to me, but it literally makes sense. I understand that gift from theater is that intelligence exists in a somatic domain as well. And building bridges between intellect and embodied awareness, and building bridges between the inside of the box and the outside of the box, and finding ways to grow an awareness of these other domains, of extending our minds beyond just our bodies, but into an awareness of how our cognition is influenced by our environments, by the artifacts we create, by the ways in which we act, by virtue of what we say and do. All these things are a much more holistic sort of an experience of intelligence, and this excites me because it's I think it's a feeling is in a way is a way of thinking as well, and again, like trying to articulate the value of this somatic sensory domain and how it can, not as an alternative to, but as a way of complementing the more rational ways in which we work and think and be. If we want to solve complex problems in the world, we've got to understand that we are beings that live and exist within the world. We're not conveniently, comfortably separated by we live in the abstract, but actually our human beings are made as organic beings, and we live and work in the world. We think in the world already. And I think there's been far too much of an acceptance of the cerebral dominance of the Cartesian notion that the head, the body is merely a taxi for the brain. So these are the kinds of things that I'm playing with at the moment, Anna, and certainly in the context of design thinking, in storytelling, and creativity. How do we unlock creativity in teams and in individuals and in organizations? That's
super cool. I'm thinking of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is a little bit more about trauma and how, okay, maybe if there's something, it may show up in a physical symptom, right? Maybe your stomach always hurts, or you start to have these physical signs that is really revealing something of a much deeper level. And of course, it kind of has this of course, nobody wants trauma. But I can just imagine if you can flip that and reframe that and say, how can our body also become this vessel and this tool for positive, in connection with all of it? That could be so powerful and so exciting.
Yeah, well, this is what we call interoception, the ability to be sensitive to our internal bodily states and the ways in which those are influenced by our thinking and interactions, but also the ways in which our internal states can be managed and therefore influence the way that we then show up and think. But remember, we're also, so those internal states, but we're also physical bodies moving in space and interacting with each other. And the ways in which we intentionally and consciously design those interactions and those physical experiences can and do influence our thinking and the quality of the way that we problem solve and ideate as well. Also our environment, whether we're in a small tiny room or if we're on top of a mountain, we perceive the world very differently. We think about our issues and problems in very different ways. And so if we're confining ourselves to the desk and the chair and small spaces, then our our view of the world is going to be limited by those constraints. So I think that's the opportunity for and it doesn't mean that everyone has to now become embodied and start exploring embodied ways of being, but everyone plays a role. And I think that building bridges between these other ways of being creative and exploring are important, as opposed to just keeping them separate and divided and doing the same thing in the same way and expecting a different result. Einstein spoke about that. But sometimes people go, yeah, we like that. We need to do things differently now. So they start doing things differently, but in the same way over and over again. I don't see how we can build a capacity for flexibility and agility without bringing a more conscious, intentional exploration of our physicality and bodies into and complementing our rational, abstract, logical.
I think it's really, for me, this is very liberating, but at the same time, being a sort of a consultant to lots of linear people in organizations where there's often a culture of fear. They don't even have time to think about this, let alone to really act upon it. There's no time, there's no space. They are confined to their desks, their cubicles, but at the same time, individually, the people, they know this is also true. So I always what I find really difficult is that people are within a context. They don't have the space to explore that embodiment. They don't have that. But individually, if you talk to them, they go, yeah. They know there's more than, the brain, the rational side of things, but they are stuck in this system that doesn't allow them to kind of move beyond that. And so, which is in a way really sad, but I do think that also listening to you and lots of other people that we need to move we need to change, we need to evolve, we need to move into that direction. But it's not so much, and I say change, I don't really mean change, actually. I mean being aware of all these things, being aware of how we are, how we live in the world, how we interact, how feelings, our gut feeling, our senses, everything kind of is also true. And I don't know, I think we're there, but I think we're kind of, there's been a shift. It's probably something that we've been part of for a long time, maybe not being aware of that. But there's something happening why these things are coming to the surface. So what you're saying, I think that is, to me, that's sort of what we should talk about. That's something that should be part of every training and every curriculum and everyone at school, starting with kids even. That embodiment, that understanding of the whole self, that is not just, it's just not life is not about math and it's more than that. But So how do you see yourself, like, or how do you see the world? Is there a shift? Is there something changing, or is it just because we are talking about it and then our lens, you know, like when you buy a red car, all of a sudden everybody has a red car. Like when you thought you were the only one with the red car, and then when you had it, you're like, oh my God, everyone has a red car. Is it that, or is there something changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely think there is something changing, because a lot needs to change. There's on the one hand, it's become apparent that some of the ways in which we continue to do things, certainly in education, for example, are stifled. There needs to be a shift. But I also think there's a more of an openness and a receptivity for other new unexplored ways of the world of work. I think that's a good question. I think that as the new generation takes the helm of a lot of organizations, because let's face it, if there's a dictatorial CEO or a boss who calls the shots and he's not into this way of working, then it may just be flogging a dead horse. There's no point in really going there if there's not going to be any kind of if it's just to tick some boxes. But I think that there are more and more people individually in their lives are becoming open to liberating themselves from very fixed mindsets and fixed ways of being. People are exploring in their own personal lives more holistic, esoteric practices, things like breathing, for example. Before that was, that was for the gurus in India, and if you were one of those, then you're on the sidelines. But now, as Gary Vaynerchuk says, the soft skills of yesterday are now the hard skills of today. And more you fall behind in realizing that how our intellect is connected intimately to our physiology, and being in a constant state of stress is not productive for creativity and for collaboration.
Hey, who knew? Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that as people begin to experience and understand through their own personal wisdom that, hey, well, there's something else here, that opens up an openness to being even more curious. Because assessing and judging and valuing these alternative embodied experiential ways of doing things, but assessing it based on a rational understanding is kind of missing the point completely. So how much allowance? I think often people talk about give yourself permission to take a risk and try something new, but that's not always easy either. That's we're wired in certain ways. We've got habitual wiring in our nervous system is wired to protect us and create a balance and harmony with our external world. But to say do something different and new, our brains don't have the neural pathways to perhaps do and explore things in different ways. And so we need to in some way disrupt that. And that takes practice. That takes the ability to kind of slow down or to just stop for a moment or to become aware of something. And then we're able to kind of start forging new neural pathways, because our lenses and our perceptions of the world, the way I understand it, are embodied in our nervous system, in our neural wiring. Mm-hmm. And so just saying the intention to do things differently isn't enough. We actually need to be co-creating and exploring what this means in reality in terms of our ability to expand our lens of perception, our ability to perceive the world from multiple angles, so that we can develop, so we can grow more pathways of choices to act on the world.
Yeah.
It almost brings me back to the traveling that you mentioned in the beginning, right? Like getting out there to realize that there's other ways of doing things. And there's this little, I don't know, story anecdote about somebody who breaks a world record in terms of speed for running. And as soon as that world record is broken, the other runners realize this is possible. And so then they just keep breaking these records because they realize it is possible to run that fast. And it's, connecting our brains and being aware and seeing new things. It's
interesting, Morgan, that you bring up that analogy, because speed is often a premium. Like faster you go, the faster you can run. Even in design thinking, on the big, you hear this like rapid, the word rapid and rough and right, and everyone go as fast as you can and move as fast as you can. But if you're going really fast, you can see ahead of you very clearly. You can see behind you really clearly. But look to the side and everything's just a blur. And so what about only way to sort of see that landscape and appreciate it is to slow down, maybe even stop, get out of the car and go towards the bush or the terrain there and touch it and feel it. And
Yeah.
And I think some people can carry on going really fast, but what about this slow lane and building capacities and abilities to experience these
Yeah.
other emotions? And
There's
then
a really beautiful there's a really beautiful Italian phrase, and I probably don't remember it perfectly, but it's fast is slow and slow is fast. And if you look at also like how, Italy as a culture lives and really enjoys their life, I think there's a lot of beauty and
yeah,
richness to be gained from that for sure.
and the American military have, as they say, slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
the phrase. That's the phrase. Yeah.
The Italians and the U.S. military, they're like, yeah. So to me, what you're talking about is if you are the one who is creating that space for people to explore these things and to either so giving options. So to Morgan's point, that you show like this is possible, and then people are like, huh. But there are other things possible. So showing people the possibilities there, to me, that's what I would call creative leadership. That you say, "Hey, did you know you could also do this? You could also stop and just look at right there where you are now. Are you aware where you now, what you're doing, instead of that you're just looking ahead of yourself, or go, you can look back, you can look to, so because people are otherwise they're stuck in this, in the system, they're stuck they're stuck in the train and it's riding, and they're afraid to stop the train, they're afraid to get off, because all they know is to kind of stay on that train. Because it's their job, it's their security, it's the thing. And I think there's something changing where that train is not that secure anymore anyway. People are unhappy there. So I meet so many people who don't want to be part of these machines anymore. They want to be part of that. They want to be free and sort of, we had a conversation on our previous podcast about a work-life balance. That is like, what are you talking about work-life? There's only life, and so that idea, I think we're slowly moving into a world where we say, wait a minute. So why are we working? What are we running towards? Right? So maybe standing still, to your point, is actually really important, but am I allowed to? So we need people in organizational structures, or we need to change the structure. I think that we can allow people to actually also stand still and stop and explore and be curious and not just do the trick they've been doing all. They learn the trick at school and they just keep repeating it. Because that's how they get rewarded. So I think there's something changing, and I too think there's something going on which is so interesting, and I don't know exactly where it's going to go, and how to grab. I love to be part of design thinking. Allowed me to be part of that the last what is it, 16, 17, 18 years. I think there's something else now. We need a new story. We need new language, new words, new story. And I think what you're doing with embodiment and I think that's part of it, the newer story. These soft skills that are the hard skills, like emotional intelligence, those kind of things. I think that empathy and that, I think that's part of a new story, a new language that we need to learn to kind of keep moving. Because I think design thinking as a language right now I think it's holding us back, to be quite honest. Mm-hmm. Not the principles of it, because I totally believe in it still, but there's it's being boxed in a little bit. It's being kind of, put a nice ribbon around it, et cetera, to be, to kind of, so consultants can sell it. But I think we need to kind of move on, and we need a new language. I don't know, Colin, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think what it is about not throwing the baby out of the bathwater, like not rejecting the current status quo, but expanding the domain, the landscape of what's possible, and building bridges between this way of working and this way of working, and so that we have a much broader, wider lens. Yes, we need our rational thinking. We need our mind. It's a beautiful thing, this beautiful brain, but the brain doesn't exist in isolation. In fact, the brain's a lot more unreliable probably than we realize. And we are constantly being informed about the world through our physical, somatic, sensory experience. It's just that it often happens on unconscious levels. If we are able to consciously refine our awareness to a point where we can intervene where it doesn't serve us, but also explore ways in which we can move our body through space, get our physicality going. What is it? Let me find this little quote to Annie Murphy Paul. The pursuit of knowledge has frequently sought to disengage thinking from the body, to elevate ideas to a cerebral sphere separate from our grubby animal anatomy. And I love that. I think our grubby animal anatomy, the closeness of the living organism, is a rich, vast domain of understanding and intelligence and knowing that I don't think we explore enough, simply because we do not habitually do that. If in the theater world that I'm influenced by and that I'm more and more draw from, when people start exploring in theater, they start moving their body straight away. We don't stand around and talk about it. We move first, and then we rationalize, then we frame it in ways that we can kind of conceptualize and drive the creative process forward, not the other way around. Right. But because there's a much wider range in the ways in which we can be creative and collaborate. And I think that dimension is missing. So building bridges between intellect and embodied, bridges between these other disparate ways of working, I think are critical and important. Also, in this age of AI and technological innovation, and we start becoming fearful of it, the robots are going to take over. But AI is an extension of our cognition. We've created these tools, and through this tool, we're able to, hopefully better the human condition. And the opportunity, because AI are going to take away and do a whole lot of the rational stuff that we did before, we don't have to keep up with it. But the opportunity is to drop deeper into our humanity, which is our living, feeling, breathing, sensing experience of being in a body.
That's really exciting. We can just be more grubby animal humans.
Yeah.
And leave the rationality up to AI. That sounds.
Let's that be our goal. To be more like the grubby animals. Yes. I really want to thank you for this conversation. We could go on, and we will maybe in another time. But for now, I thank you so much for this conversation. I think all of the things that you're about, and you're talking about, and this, to me, it's really liberating. So I love that, and it makes me so hungry for going back to theater experiences and learning more about that, and kind of, because you're so right, and there's this whole world out there of theater that I don't know anything about, but there's always this voice in my head saying, this is so interesting. So I want to know more. So thank you for sparking that, kind of putting a spark back into my my world again. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
And it's also very inspiring for me, because sometimes, of course, I look at the world and I say, oh no, this is not going well. But then to know that there's people out there embodying and thinking about these things and bringing them and helping people experience things in new ways, that's what inspires me. It's like, okay, it might not be as bad as I think after all. So so thank you so much for sharing, Colin.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. Thanks, Hane. It was great. Lovely to chat with you both.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right.